And I'm just waiting for Venus to push the button.
Not every time.
I'd appreciate it. I mean, you don't have to. In fact, appreciate it if you didn't. But what am I going to say? All right. So Cold War. Um, what even is that, and what was it, and um, yeah, all kinds of stuff. The point. So many of us, I'm not sure about all of us, but certainly a subsection lived through part of the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, and may even feel like we've got a pretty good handle on some of the basics. I'm not here to, reinvent the wheel. I'm going to go over those basics, but also something that I never knew growing up is how far-reaching and multi-layered the Cold War was, and also how it continues to impact us to this day. And so I'm hopefully going to showcase some of those things. And then just to kind of brief, the images that I've got on display here are all related to the Cold War in some way, shape, or form. I will make reference to them as I kind of come up with the topics, but if anybody has a question, please feel free to shout it out. And this is not like some kind of formal environment. If you have a question, you can just blurt it out. That's totally fine.
Well, it'd be kind of hard to see us raise our hands.
Well, there you go. That's fair. Yeah. Okay. So, um, the Cold War is, rather than being over land, it was a war about ideas. And the idea at the core of the conflict was capitalism versus communism. And that's a really simple thing, but it is also, what do those terms even mean? What aspect of them was kind of core to the conflict? I am not going to go into the origins of capitalism and the origins of communism or anything to that degree. Um, what I will say is the core tenet that was a matter of debate was who owns property. Generally speaking, in a capitalist society, an individual or a corporation or something along those lines can own property. In the communist societies, the idea was that these property is collectively owned. It eventually just more or less becomes state owned, but the state is supposed to be the representative of the people, and so again, the kind of the idea that it is collectively owned. That's really the core message. I know for a lot of my childhood, there was an effort to declare. I don't know if this is a particularly Canadian phenomenon, um, but there was an effort to declare that the Cold War was about democracy, democracy promotion, and the safety or the sanctity of democracy in the face of um, tyranny, which is how a lot of media that I grew up with characterized the Soviet Union. The problem with that is, and we will go over that, democracy is not promoted, at least as a primary objective, in most of the Cold War, and it's just not a feature. No matter how much democratic rulers may have wanted to kind of side with the idea of democracy, um, they also sponsored coups that overturned democratic elections to install a capitalist um, authoritarian government. So um, the the long and the short of it is that the Cold War was a conflict over who should own things, and it was the two parties are the capitalists and the communists. Um, I think based on where we all live, we're familiar with who the capitalists would have been. Uh, but an idea of who the communists are, well, it's the Soviet Union, which is a country that no longer exists. Um, and the Soviet Union comprised all of modern day Russia. It also had um, modern day Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan. So all these Central Asian republics here. Countries such as Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and then Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltics, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. Those were all incorporated into the Soviet Union. Um, Other communist countries that were allied with the Soviet Union but not part of it included East Germany, Poland, Hungary, and I'll go into how those became communist and kind of what happened there. But initially, despite the fact that communism is a revolutionary idea, and there were those in the Soviet Union that wanted to export communism around the world, communism largely after the October Revolution in 1917, it largely stayed within the Soviet Union. Um, but so yeah, so it was not being exported. Various governments were upset with the communist takeover of Russia at the time, and they tried to support groups that were part of the old regime. These were called the Whites or White troops. Um, and this is in contrast to the Red Army. The Reds are the communists, and the Whites were the other parties. Uh, there was no real like organized resistance. White armies were kind of parceled up and spread thinly throughout the country, and so the Red Army eventually just took them all out. But as I said, stayed largely within the Soviet Union. Um, in the run up to the Second World War, or basically within the Second World War, um, a major blow against Nazi growth was struck when the Soviet Union and the Nazis signed a non-aggression pact. This is the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, and what this meant was we won't attack each other, and let's dismember Poland. That's what they agreed to, and so the Soviet Union took half of Poland, the Nazis took the other half. This is the event that triggers the Second World War in general in 1939. But the Soviet Union and the Nazis do not stay friends for long, and Hitler invades in 1941, setting off Operation Barbarossa. What this means is that the Soviet Union is looking for allies, and we are also fighting the Nazis. And so, even though we do not have any agreement whatsoever with practically anything to do with the Soviet Union, for the most part, the Soviet Union had stayed within their own borders. They had invaded some other countries. People weren't thrilled with them, especially in their conquest of the Baltics, and taking half of Poland. But when you're under threat of invasion or actually under invasion from the Nazis, war makes strange bedfellows. And so, through a program called Lend Lease, the United States more or less funded a giant chunk of the material that flowed into the Soviet Union that helped them fend off the Nazis. The Soviets paid with blood, and the Americans paid with dollars. This eventually led to the Allied victory over the Nazis. And in the run up to that, when it was looking more and more like the Nazis were going to lose the war, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin, the leaders of Britain and the Soviet Union respectively, met secretly in Moscow in 1944 and decided to start carving up Europe. This is a photocopy of the original note. They came to what's called the Percentages Agreement, where in these different countries in Europe, the Soviet Union would have this percentage of influence, and then the Western world would have this percentage of influence. So, for the most part, the Soviet Union would have more influence in Bulgaria, but they would have much less influence in Greece, more influence in Hungary and Romania, and the two powers would split Yugoslavia. This is an overtly imperialist kind of understanding of things, and it also is under the impression that the Soviets are going to play by our rules. And so this was this was not a formal treaty, but it was an understanding that all the powers had going out of the Second World War after victory is there would be some kind of power sharing agreement. A more formal power sharing agreement was then solidified in Yalta, and this one was written down, and it was a formal treaty. I think a treaty. But regardless, um, this outlined, who do the Soviets get to absorb into their sphere of influence, and who do the Allies or who do the Western powers kind of look to. This sets up the kind of opening front lines of the Cold War. But, and this is crucially important, at least from a Western perspective, everybody is friends. It's very tentative, it's very terrifying, but for the most part, everybody is friends. And then we get the Gruzenko affair. This is a defector from the Soviet Secret Intelligence Service, the GRU. This is later reformed into the. Hold on, I'll try and remember it. No, I can't think of it now. Soviet KGB. The GRU is a predecessor to the KGB. But Igor Gruzenko was in the Canadian Bureau in Ottawa. He was a Soviet diplomat in technically, but officially he was under the table he was a Soviet spy, and he was doing all kinds of spying on us and through us the other allies. And as it turns out, he and his wife were given the ability to live off of the diplomatic compound in Ottawa. And so they just rented an apartment like a normal couple would, and couldn't believe what was available to an individual in Ottawa as compared to what he had experienced living in Moscow, and did not want to give that up. And
Milk in a bag.
yes, milk in a bag. We didn't
Mm-hmm.
put it wasn't in bags at that time. It would have been in glass bottles.
Mm.
But it was a good life, and he didn't want to give it up, and he didn't want to go home. And he was recalled early, and instead of going back to the Soviet Union, he defected. In typical Canadian fashion, we received his concern and ignored him, and ignored him, and ignored him, and ignored him. And eventually we're like, oh shit, well, what did that file say? A spy? So eventually this blew up. It just took a very long time. And the Soviet spy ring, or at least the initial Soviet spy ring, was broken up. But this is paralleled by similar programs in the UK. I'm not sure if there was ever one in Britain. The UK one is, I think they're called the Cambridge Five. Yeah, a spy ring. These were Britons that were ideologically aligned with the Soviet Union rather than Soviet citizens themselves that defected. Um, oh, this is a little later though. This is 1950s. So, so the Gruzenko affair really is kind of the opening salvo, letting us know, hey, these guys are not our allies, and we need to do something about that. Even though we, defeated Hitler together, the world is a different. Things are different now. So that's just kind of the opening salvo. Um, Anybody have any questions on that first little section there?
What are your thoughts on the Cambridge Five being the first boy band?
1950s. Why not? Sure.
Is So I have a question that may be in the lineup or maybe not, but it's about the terms first world, second world, third world countries. Is
Hmm.
that something that
It is
you
something I
will
am
be
going to
getting
be.
to?
Yeah, I'm going to
Okay.
talk about it. Those lines don't exist yet in the kind of
Okay.
chronology that I'm covering.
That's
Um,
kind of my question. Yeah. That's
yeah,
comes later then.
yeah, but not that much later. I think it's in my next set of tabs. Let me just make sure. Uh,
Well,
no,
I
not
will
quite.
put my pants back on and wait patiently.
Okay, so I'm just gonna turn this back on. All right, so we now know that the Soviets were spying on us throughout the war, and maybe aren't the most allied of allies, but we still are proceeding with the plan as we thought it should be, which is there were going to be power sharing agreements in various countries for percentages of influence. And so, one of the things that we, as the Western allies, allowed to happen was elections in the various occupied countries. So in Czechoslovakia, Poland, um, I think a few others. I didn't want to list like 14 kind of countries. But we expected these to be free and fair democratic elections like we have. But of course, the Soviets don't play by those rules, and so violence and intimidation was uh, occurred throughout the elections. Soviet either direct Soviet surrogates or Soviet not pawns. What's the word I'm looking for? So either direct agents of the Soviet state or their kind of representatives, one step removed, won these
Like
elections.
puppets.
Yeah, puppets. I guess that's probably better. Um, and so one by one, these countries elected, but it's elected communist governments. And then once in government, the communist parties use the power of the state to essentially institute one party rule. That was not the election. That was not what they were promised, but that was the plan from the Soviet kind of perspective. And the thing with one party rule is you can't share power. There's only one person or one party in power. And so very quickly the percentages agreement started to fall apart, and it was very clear that um, that Europe was being kind of um, taken over. I think that I think it's an Eisenhower quote, but it might be a Churchill quote when he says, that there is an iron curtain forming around Europe, and then the iron curtain is this idea that goes throughout the entirety of the Cold War. Um, the various allies, when they defeated Germany, agreed to split the country up into four occupation zones. Germany was not allowed to be its own country after the Second World War. All of the allies occupied the country, and as I said, they split it up into four. The Soviet Union took one of the quarters. The Americans took one. The British took one, and the French took one. Fairly quickly, the French, the British, and the American quarters merged into what they started calling just generically West Germany, or the German Democratic Republic. No, not the German. Oh God, I think it's the German Democratic Republic, but no, because the DDR is Deutsches, and that's the anyway. I can't remember. It's the it was a democratic Germany, West Germany. Um, but the capital of West Germany, they wanted it to be. It eventually was placed in Bonn, but they wanted it to be in Berlin, and Berlin is in East Germany, in the Soviet section. and Berlin was supposed to be administered separately. It had its own occupation zones. And so there was a West Berlin and an East Berlin. West Berlin belonging to the Western Allies, and then East Berlin belonging to the Soviet Union. And the Soviets thought that this was just stupid and they should get all of Berlin. And so they started blockading traffic to Berlin so that Western allies couldn't bring supplies to West Berlin. And they thought, okay, so it's just one city. The Allies aren't going to raise a stink over it. They'll just give up. That was the idea. Instead, led by the Americans, and this is one of the most, I don't know, I consider it extremely inspiring. They started what's known as the Berlin Airlift. And the city of Berlin was supplied entirely by air from 1948, April 1948 till May 1949, over a year. They flew flights day in, day out to supply the city to make sure that its inhabitants had enough resources to live. All because the roadways and the railways were blocked off by the Soviet Union. Eventually, the Soviets relented. They just couldn't believe that the Americans would waste that much money. And West Berlin stayed under the control of the Western Allies. But this is another escalation in the development of the Cold War. But it's still not. It's still people had just been through a very nasty war, and so they're still trying to find friends. In 1949, the East German elections happened. This is the takeover of East Germany, and similar to the Polish and Czech elections. Also in 1949, another communist country appears on the map, and this is China. China had just finished the Chinese Civil War, so the Second World War starts earlier in China than it does in Europe. Japan invades. Japan invades Korea in 1904, I think, 1904, 1910, something like that. And so they conquered Korea, and then they invade Manchuria in, I think, 1933 or 1934. And at this point in time, China is in tatters. It's called the warlord era, and basically the imperial government had fallen in 1911, and various generals had set themselves up as regional powers. So China was just a constant chaos, and so Japan kind of entered into this chaos by conquering a giant swath of China. And one of the warlords, um, a guy named Chiang Kai-shek. He's nominally the president of China, but he fights off the Japanese, and is largely successful, except when he's betrayed by his supposed allies, the Communist Party of China. Because they are fighting a civil war over who gets to control China. The Communist Party is one of these kind of warlord factions spread throughout the country. And they make several agreements over the years to not fight each other so that they can fend off the Japanese. And the communists renege on several of those agreements over the years, so that the nationalists are called the army of Chiang Kai-shek is more involved in fighting off the Japanese than the communists have to be. So that once the Second World War ends in 1945 and the Civil War can kind of resume in earnest, one group has been battered by the Japanese for 5 years, and another group is kind of fresh and resupplied from a good friend in Moscow. Um, and so the communists defeat the nationalists. Chiang Kai shek retreats off of the mainland of China to the island of Taiwan. That's thus creating the modern. I mean, you want to call it a state, you want to call it a province, like whatever. Taiwan, as we know it today, comes from the aftermath of the Chinese Civil War.
I'm in danger.
Yes. And so totally threw my train of thought there. Sorry. So Taiwan comes out of that conflict, and the communists are now in control of China. This terrifies Western powers because previously the revolutionary kind of communist spirit had been largely contained within the Soviet Union. But now it's in China, and who knows where it's going to go next. And so, as part of this, NATO is formed. NATO stands for the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and it is a defensive pact, largely in defense against the Soviet Union. And it is intended to, again, be purely defensive. It is, there's no, if a NATO country attacks another country, there's no mechanism within NATO to have allies come to help. That's just not how it functions. But it is there to, if you are invaded, we all come to defend you. And this is kind of this is really ramping things up. And then, of course, the Korean War starts. So Japan had been the imperial power controlling Korea since as I said, 1910, I think it was. But with the defeat of Japan, Korea is now free. It's allowed to be its own country again. And just like in Europe, the Soviets had they had taken over a portion of Korea, and the Western Allies took over a portion of Korea. We know those now today as North and South Korea. In the immediate aftermath of the Second World War and the kind of the rebirth of independent Koreas, the North was far more wealthy. The North was receiving direct aid from the Soviet Union in both farming equipment and also military equipment in an attempt to get another ally in the region. They wanted the North to take over the South. The North declared war and tried to invade, and strangely enough, the Americans went to the UN. The UN had just been created in 1945, and the idea for the UN was to prevent wars, to prevent suffering. That's the function that the UN still serves to this day, in theory. And you may recall that the Soviet Union then and Russia now have a permanent veto on the Security Council. And so if they want to do anything, if the UN wants to do anything, the Soviet Union, the Americans, the Brits, they could all just say no and it would never happen. And the Americans went to the UN and said, this unprovoked aggression from the North needs to be stopped. We need to send in a UN force into Korea in order to shore up support for the democratic government in the South and, keep things going. The government in the South was nominally democratic. It was not really, but whatever. But the thing is that at this point in time, the Soviet Union was boycotting the UN. They didn't think it had any value. And everyone else who had a permanent seat thought that it was a good idea to prevent the Soviets from getting another satellite in Korea. And so the Korean War started as a UN as a defensive force defending South Korea, sponsored by the UN. And so the Soviet Union did not directly intervene because there were ramifications. This is a UN sanctioned force. Over the course of the Korean War, I'm not going to go into any major details, but let's just say that the North almost had everything conquered once the UN force was called up. The Allies landed and pushed the North all the way back, and then they started pushing into Northern territory. At that point, China, sensing problems for their neighbor, North Korea, they invaded. Communist China invaded. They didn't give a shit what the Security Council said. Ultimately, the war has never ended. There's still a state of war between North and South Korea, but they have a DMZ, a demilitarized zone, and the war hasn't been hot since 1953. Okay, so that was a big chunk of kind of late 40s, early 50s, and I swear, Weenus, I am getting to the first, second, and third world stuff. But does anybody have any questions on that chunk of stuff that I just went over? Don't all speak up at once. It gets confusing. I can't hear everyone.
I do not.
Fair. Okay. Well, I'm going to just jump into the next section then. So what we have started to see is rising tensions and the potential for actual war. We have the Korean War. That is not a Cold War. That is a hot conflict, but the Soviets did not participate directly. They provided materiel support, but they did not directly support the North, whereas the Americans did very much, as we did, very much supported the South. They also, the Soviets, had problems in their own territories of control. This whole period of time, the kind of early 50s, is characterized by some uprising, revolts, and coups from both parties, as people are trying to assert who controls what and where. So there is an East German uprising in 1953. Basically, they just want the Soviets out. They dislike the overtly totalitarian government of Stalin, and absolutely can't stand it. Doesn't go well for them. The Soviets crushed the rebellion. There is a nominally socialist government in Guatemala that has communist sympathies that the Americans decide doesn't belong there anymore. This is the famous Banana Republic, the fruit company with the United Fruit Company sponsored this coup because the government was giving them less favorable contracts. But this is the start of American interventionism in Central and South America, where they install their own favored government. And then NATO had been formed in 1949. In 1955, NATO allowed for, well, the Western powers allowed for the rearmament of West Germany and the entrance of West Germany into NATO. So they basically had accepted that West Germany and East Germany are not going to be unified anytime soon, and we're going to treat West Germany as its own country, and that country is now in NATO. That absolutely terrified the ever-living shit out of the Soviets. And later that year, they created their own pseudo-defensive pact called the Warsaw Pact. So the Warsaw Pact is the Soviet Union, but all of its other allied countries. So we've got Albania, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungarian People's Republic, Polish People's Republic, Socialist Republic of Romania, and the Soviet Union. Very quickly, though, different countries who enter into this pact realize they don't want to be in it. They don't want to be here. In 1956, Hungary wants out. So there is a revolution in Hungary, and a new government is installed that wants out of the Warsaw Pact and out of the Soviet sphere of influence. The Soviets send tanks, and they crush the rebellion. If you've ever heard the term tanky, when in discussion of support for communist ideology or communist thought, that is the origin of it. Is people who continued to support the Soviet Union in the wake of sending tanks into Hungary. It's a bit hypocritical on our part because, of course, we send tanks into Central American countries. So I had a lot more outrage about the Hungarian Revolution when I was much younger, because I didn't really fully understand how many coups we had participated in, or at least the West had participated in. But at the end of the day, just because we also do a bad, it doesn't mean that it wasn't bad for everyone to do the bad. So, just look at all of these things as refusing to let people kind of follow their own will. Spud, if you see the thread called Cold War in the text channel, I'm just trying to keep everything in there to make it easier for me to follow and also refer back to.
Oh, and also, Spud, one coup might be distasteful, but two coups is delicious. Couscous.
Oh, Cusco. Okay, there we
Cusco?
go. Cusco. What's his name? Cusco. Okay. Just making sure everyone's
Kitty.
awake.
Hold the lever, Kronk. Wrong
Why do we even
lever!
have that lever?
I love it.
And so,
Clearly, there's some Emperor's New Groove love in here.
oh yeah, I have my cat's name is Yzma.
Oh,
I
my
love
friend
you.
just got two cats, and they're Yzma and Kronk.
Aw.
So we're firmly in the Cold War now. The battle lines have been drawn. There have already been several hot and kind of tense engagements. And this is when the world gets divided up into what is called the Three Worlds System. So anyone who grew up in 80s and 90s and before, they're familiar with some nomenclature that's, this is a first world country, that's a second world country, or a third world country. Well, what the hell does that even mean? Because it was never explained to us other than first world is good and that's what we are. At least that's my experience growing up. First world countries are outlined in blue here, and they are either NATO members or nominally allied with the NATO mission. They are not necessarily democratic. Again, they have capitalist governments. They are capitalistic economic systems. The countries outlined in red are the second world, and so they are allies of the Warsaw Pact, either directly or just nominally, and they have communist economic systems. They're also, their standard of living is less than that in the first world. The depending on where you lived in the second world, your standard of living, could be quite high, but your standard of living, even at its highest in the second world, is only going to be like about mid in the first world. And then finally, we've got the third world, which are countries technically not aligned with either party. That's what the term comes from. But it also is the least developed countries, ones that need help on infrastructure, on they have famine, they have war, and all kinds of things. Um, the the third world is really the plaything of the first and second world countries. So they're fighting over aspects of the third world if they haven't successfully fully integrated it into their area. Oh, is you're wondering why Sweden and Finland are in the third world, Spud? So that's because of their alliance. Technically, Sweden and Finland were unaligned during the Cold War. They only recently joined NATO after Russia's aggression in Ukraine, which should tell you something, that they felt they could go at it alone during the Cold War, but now they feel the need to join NATO. And that's why I say that it's more of an alliance thing than a pure economics, even though we do tend to associate it with the underdeveloped economics of, say, Africa or India in the say 60s through the 80s.
Or Ireland. Take that, Ireland.
Yeah, I guess Ireland would also be unaligned. That's almost certainly because of historic hatred of Britain, being their former colonial masters.
Something everyone can agree on.
Historic? More like continuing?
Fair enough. Fair enough. But that's the origin of the first through third world. Nowadays, people talk of the global north and the global south. I don't particularly like these terms because they are more directly linked to development. Any country that is in the global north is developed, and any country that is in the global south is not. And I don't think that that's necessarily the best way to talk about these things. And it also becomes contentious because people throw, I mean, as anything in this, people throw their own politics into it. Where you get a country like China referred to as the global south when it's the second largest GDP in the world, and it's like I don't have a lot of patience for that. So yeah, so that's the kind of the battle lines of the Cold War, and the first major conflict of the Cold War is the space race. So the space race, broadly speaking, I think we probably know that the Russians were the first into space. They launched Sputnik in 1957. Sputnik was little more than a radio transmitter in a steel ball. But the fact of the matter is that they got it up there before anybody else. Very quickly, the Americans looked to where they could press their advantage, and manned flight, particularly manned landing on the moon, seemed to fit American um, strengths, and so that became their focus. Um, I don't know how strong the space race was portrayed in the Soviet Union. I do think that it was mostly a kind of Western world phenomenon where we talked about it as, this kind of big fight we're in with the Soviets. Not to say that the Soviets weren't aware of the conflict, but I just I don't think that they were competing in the same fashion. Um, and it should not be overlooked the fact that nobody really cared about the ideals of the space race. The whole let's do research and technology and propel the species forward and all the. This was in order to research ICBMs. The space race was about getting a nuclear missile from one side of the globe to the other. ICBM stands for Intercontinental Ballistic Missile, and that technology didn't exist at the beginning of the space race, and it did exist at the end of the space race. The ability to launch a missile essentially up and out into orbit. It would go around the globe and then turn around and come in and crash down on your enemies. And the space race was largely about developing that as a viable technology. Spud's put in here. Oh, this is the Soviet? Oh, what's the American rocket? Something 5, right?
Saturn V.
Saturn 5. So I guess N1.
I am muted. Yes, Saturn V. Yeah, the N1 is the same as the Saturn V, or similar to.
Right. Probably both based on the same stolen German designs.
I mean, possibly. Although, in interest, if you want to be a giant rocket nerd for a pause moment, the modern rockets that we are currently dabbling with use the same engine design as the Soviet N1s do, with the multiple, instead of one to three enormous rocket engine, or 1 to 4 enormous rocket engines. The Soviet one has a flared base, which has got like 20 rocket engines, similar to the way the Starship stuff is going now. It's just we have computers to control it, and the Soviets were using slide rules and guesstimation, and their rockets tipped over and exploded. If you want to see horrifying rocket explosions, there's some incredible ones of unfortunate magnitude when they were trying to get to the moon.
Fair enough. That's it for this section. Does anybody have any questions, or you want a further conversation about rocket nerds? If we got a couple of rocket nerds in the audience and you want to add to the discussion, that's I have only a certain set of knowledge here. But
I
any
spent a
questions?
lot of time at Edwards Air Force Base and NASA when I was a kid, so my input is spam in a can. It's one of the astronauts labeled the pods that they were to be floating around the Earth in and then being sent to the moon in. They called it spam in a can. It's not wrong. It's tiny little space.
Any other comments, questions, conversations?
What year approximately time frame are we in the journey right now? Are we mid to late 60s? Are we?
We are
69,
just,
right?
No. Well, the space race ends in 69. That's when the moon landing happens. But
It's not the only thing that ends in 69. Go on.
Ultimately, we are right around 1960. So 57 is when Sputnik goes up and kicks off the space race. And my next point is the deploying of Jupiter missiles, which are medium range ballistic missiles in 1958, 59, and 60.
They were trying to use the space race to kind of bring people together within the individual countries that were part of the race to kind of be like, hey, look, we're going to do the thing.
Yeah, joint
It was a
action.
diversion in many ways. There was a tactic to it that was a diversion, encouraging nationalism, that kind of thing.
Like a common goal to unite the people.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I can say that and understand it and accept it because it's true, and also geek out about it because the space race is like the coolest shit that I've ever seen. It's
Oh,
still
yeah, it's fun.
the the um, the advancement in computers that the space race prompted is the reason why we have all of the things that we have today. Um, it's entirely possible that the advancement would have happened eventually on its own, but the Apollo guidance computer kind of was a proving ground for solid state electronics, transistors, and so on. And they more or less showed that, like, no, this shit's good now.
I think it wasn't until the late 90s and early 2000s when they outfitted their first ship, their first spaceship, with computers that would actually do the math completely and fully themselves for just a whole bunch of like positioning while they're in orbit and landings and takeoffs and stuff. Otherwise, especially while they're in orbit, the astronauts have to know an extreme level of math and be able to do it very, very quickly to figure out the tiniest little thrusts and adjustments to be able to move just right in orbit or they would crash. I was actually in one of the spaceships that was out at NASA. It was one of the ones where they open up the back of it and they pull the satellites in and do repairs to them. And
With
they
the
were
Canadarm?
putting one of yeah, and they were putting one of those computers in it, so I got to see the inside of the cockpit and I got to walk inside the bay where the Canadarm is and everything. It was really cool.
That's awesome.
I've been in a couple of spaceships. I wanted to be an astronaut, something terrible, so but scoliosis, they don't like that.
Spud has put in actually one of my favorite videos. So if you've never watched Smarter Every Day on YouTube, it's a guy named Destin. He's a rocket engineer and a hick. Maybe actually a hick and then a rocket engineer in that order. But he's solid good people, and he geeks out about all kinds of really really awesome engineering things. And he went down to look at the Apollo guidance computer and a bunch of Apollo equipment with Linus from Linus Tech Tips. This is a couple of years back. It's a really great video. Highly recommend it if people are giant nerds and haven't seen the video yet.
You mentioned a number of hot conflicts leading up to this, and that was the first release song of the Cambridge Five was called "Hot Conflict."
Hot conflicts.
Yeah.
All right. I think we're developing the lore.
Do it.
Any other questions, comments, concerns? Are you still awake? Do I need to make a noise, wake people up?
There you go.
I asked for that.
We weren't awake before, we sure shit are now.
I asked for that.
Open mouth, insert foot.
You really did. Knowing full well who is in here.
Yeah.
Lizard.
Oh, lizard.
Nice, sir.
All right. Jumping into the next kind of stage of things. The Americans decide to put fucking nuclear rockets all over the globe. Well, mostly in Europe. So the Jupiter missile program, medium-range ballistic missiles, they can't go into orbit, but they can go from, say, France to Ukraine. And they start deploying these rockets all over, anywhere in Europe that will take them. France argues about it for a while. I think they get them into Italy. But the big one, and the one that becomes relevant fairly quickly, is Turkey. They got a bunch of rocket installations in Turkey. And this rewinds a little bit. Back in the 1950s, there was a dictatorial government in Cuba run by a guy named Batista, I think. Yeah. And it was overthrown by Fidel Castro. Now, Fidel Castro initially, and his movement, the 26th of July movement, it's not overtly communist. He has communists in his ranks. In the top right there, you'll see Che Guevara, who an entire generation of people paid money to put his face on their merchandise, which makes me chuckle to no end, because he was a communist and that would have offended him deeply. But in any event, Che was a deeply ideological communist, and he was part of Castro's revolution. But Castro just really, really wanted Batista out. The government was horrendously corrupt, and he tried to kind of parlay with the states and see if things could work out, and it just did not. And so he he tilted full bore into the Soviet Union because Cuba is very close to the American border, and the idea that the Soviets could have an ally right there was very appealing to them. And so things are heating up. Then in 1960, an American spy plane, a U-2 spy plane, is crash lands. The plane is captured and the pilot is captured. The U-2 was the most effective spy piece of spy equipment before satellites, and one, it was believed to be like that it couldn't crash, that it would never be shot down. And two, that the Soviets had nothing comparative to it. And one of those was true. The Soviets didn't have anything that compared to the U-2. But this was a huge, tense moment getting the pilot back. I don't think they got the plane back. So all that surveillance equipment was captured by the Soviet government. And things started to get very, very tense between the Soviet Union and particularly the Americans. And then comes the election of JFK. Now, JFK was assassinated in '63. I don't know if anyone here, I don't think anyone here is old enough to have been alive when he was president. I only know of JFK in kind of rose-tinted retrospectives of what it was to have an American president who was so interesting and so this and so that. The one thing that JFK was aggressive and reckless, and firmly anti-communist. So those ballistic missiles in Turkey was JFK. He was continuing on a project that had been started by Eisenhower before him, but Turkey was a step closer. It was another provocation. So he did that. Castro had started his revolution in '53. It finished in '59. JFK doesn't become president till '61, and then immediately tries to oust Castro with the Bay of Pigs invasion. This is a catastrophic military incursion where the United States attempted to invade and depose Cuba's government, Castro. Amidst all of this rising tension and provocation from the American president, the Soviets decide that the time has come for East Berlin to be firmly segregated from West Berlin. And what starts off as a chain link kind of fence and eventually becomes the Berlin Wall is seen here. The barrier is put up that blockades one half of the city from the other. And this is not, this is not to keep the outside in. This is to keep the inside in, to prevent people from leaving. And then we get the Cuban Missile Crisis. The Cuban Missile Crisis is quite possibly the closest that we came to annihilation as a species in at least the last 100,000 years. The idea was that those medium-range ballistic missiles, similar to the ones that Kennedy had put in Turkey, Khrushchev, the new leader in the Soviet Union, wanted to put them in Cuba. And Kennedy refused to allow such a, what he would call a provocation, but what was really tit for tat. And so he instituted not a blockade, because a blockade is an act of war, but he instituted what he called a quarantine, which was a blockade of Cuba. And the Soviet ships with the warheads were heading towards Cuba in an attempt to arm the missiles that were already in place. And it came down to the last minute. The order was given to Soviet troops to fire. So the Soviet ships were approaching the American blockade, and the order came in for them to fire. And they disobeyed that order. And I think we should all be forever grateful that they did disobey that order. Well, basically they used plausible deniability of, we can't be sure if this came through on official channels. We have to make sure, we have to verify. And so they stalled to double verify, and by that point Moscow had lost their nerve. And so the Soviets backed down, but in exchange the Americans pulled missiles out of Turkey. And, nuclear apocalypse was averted. But it was very tense. Very, very, very tense. And one could say that this is the kind of the height of the Cold War. Even though a whole bunch of things happen afterwards, this is when it was the closest to all-out nuclear apocalypse. For the remaining, what did I have this for? This I don't think is. Sorry, I don't know why this tab is here. Since 1949, the Chinese communists had been pretty good allies with the Soviets. But in 1955, Joseph Stalin died. And Nikita Khrushchev took over as leader of the Soviet Union. And he actively went about a process he called de-Stalinization, where Stalin had a kind of cult of personality, photos of him everywhere, hail leader and all these sorts of things. And he wanted to get away from that entirely. Well, the leader of Communist China, Mao Zedong, really, really liked the whole cult of personality thing, and didn't like the process of de-Stalinization. And so it started a rift that was eventually split wide open, where these two countries, which were ostensibly communist allies, then became strategic adversaries. And instead of Russia going on expeditions across the ocean to try and open up a new front line in Cuba against the Americans, they now had to look across their entire land border, because they had Western countries on their borders in Europe and China on its borders in the east. And that kind of enters in a new era of the Cold War. Any questions so far on that section? The U-2 spy plane is the black jet flying there.
Bono was one of the pilots.
So, sorry?
Bono from U2 was one of the pilots.
Yeah, I didn't say it. I was face palming. I was just like, wah, wah.
Not your best work.
Yeah. Also not my worst.
Fair. That is fair.
It could get worse.
Can can always get worse. All right. Anything at all? I know from experience that if I don't get any questions, it's because I'm boring you, and so I really would appreciate any kind of question or query or anything.
I did have a question about the Cuban Missile Crisis, and that is, so they were trying to get nuclear warheads to Cuba, or they already had one already armed in Cuba,
I didn't go
and
into.
they're trying to get more.
I didn't actually read all of the details about it. My vague recollection of the crisis is that they had the untipped missiles deployed, and then they were bringing the warheads in. But maybe they
Got it.
had one already. I'm not sure.
And
I-
then
I
when
think
the
that
ships
was the whole scandal. I think, sorry to interrupt, was I think that they didn't know how many they had. Like there was assumptions that they had one or some, and that more were coming, but they already had the missiles ready and pointed. So it was logistically put the batteries in the remote and shoot kind of thing.
Mhm.
Gotcha.
How
And
accurate was X-Men First Class as regards to the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Oh Lord.
Michael Ironside was there. Um,
Can we all thank him for preventing annihilation of humankind?
no, he was
But-
on the American side.
Sorry.
you know what he has in his house? The Iron Curtain for his windows.
Ba-doom, ba-doom,
Told you
tis.
it got worse.
It did get worse.
Sorry, Weenus,
So-
to cut you off there. Sorry, Rel.
Yeah, sorry. I was just sorry.
So you did mention that they pulled the missiles out of Turkey. Do we still have missiles in other countries?
The that particular program, what was it called now again? The Jupiter program was already kind of on the way out in terms of technological relevance. So those missiles, I believe, are completely removed from any country.
That's
But
good.
American nuclear tipped warheads in other countries, yeah, you got them everywhere. Not
That's
here.
really unnerving because last our last president, he had approved a push for a bunch of money to redo the silos that we have a bunch of missiles stored in here in the US. So we have underground silos that will launch the missiles here. The problem is they haven't been remodeled since they were put in, and they are deteriorating, and some of them are starting to crumble and they need to be replaced. So our last president had worked with a bunch of people to get money approved for it, and our current one has decided to reroute every penny of that, so those are not getting upgraded, which means if those collapse, if we go boom, please feel bad for our stupidity.
Fortunately,
if I'm,
they won't-
can I
yeah,
ask?
Yeah, go ahead.
What country where do you live? What country are you? What country
I'm
do
in
you live
California, so I'm in
Oh.
the US.
Oh, okay, sorry.
You're good, no worries. No, that was one of those things I was gobsmacked when I found out that we hadn't been maintaining those as well. But I mean, everything deteriorates eventually. Nothing lasts forever.
If
And
it's
I
a-
was
if it's any consolation, those missiles require floppy disks to operate.
God.
Yeah.
Are
And
they
if
the
we
big
have
ones or are they the
missiles-
little ones?
When we have missiles in Europe, those will probably be closer to our enemies than launching them from
I
home,
do-
anyways.
I'm
yeah,
not so
n-
worried about us launching them. I'm more worried about the silos collapsing because they are deteriorating and what that's going to look like, and if that will cause anything bad.
If that would
ostensibly
cause
not
the
really.
device- I don't
Yeah,
think that would cause the device to detonate, but still, it can't be good.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's-
that's what I'm thinking. Like, even if it just leaches something into the soil, like there's nothing that
No,
could be
no,
good
you're-
about a warhead being shoved underground in such a way that it's insanely difficult to get back out safely. Like,
It's
only
it's
good
a
thing I
very
could
small
see
amount of
is-
material, and it's very well contained, and it's not really a threat. It would take a
The only-
lot more to detonate it.
The only good thing that could come of it is if it did leach, we might get the Ninja Turtles.
that's fair.
That's true.
I'd
Yeah,
be okay with
that'd
that.
actually be sick.
I think you
Oh,
need to.
Splinter.
You need nuclear. I think it's nuclear waste though, technically, to get
You
the
are
mutations,
because the
not
outside world rejects you.
not refined plutonium or uranium. Or technically, they're
Sorry, see,
probably
I don't
hydrogen
like.
bombs now, so it's
Say
mostly
that
it's
again.
mostly it's mostly
That's just
hydrogen deuteride and lithium, I think, in the modern weapons. But nerd.
Probably all of it.
just none of it seems very good. If you're gonna have something that dangerous, you should probably take care of it appropriately.
Taking care of things is good.
You know, fast forwarding to the future of this conversation, not to segue, but that is one of the biggest dangers of the end of this situation is, while the United States might not be taking great care of the weapons that they have that are old, when the Soviet Union fell apart, that was way worse, because then no one was funding it, no one was cared, and they're like, where are the missiles? And everyone just did shrug emoji.
Well,
Yeah,
It-
that was a major effort.
yeah,
so-
we're gonna end up there in the future. Jeez.
I have a question. And maybe you actually answered this. Why did Turkey allow U.S. to put missiles in their country if it was going to provoke, the Soviet Union to respond, as as you said, tit for tat?
Right. I don't know of the specific arrangements. Normally, these things come with either trade concessions or just straight outright bribes. But Turkey
Yeah.
was
Okay.
and still is a member of NATO, so they're
Mhm.
part of our defensive alliance. And so it could be just as simple as the United States asked and Turkey said yes.
They
Um,
probably, if they were part of NATO, they were probably thinking that it's just as beneficial for them to have those missiles there, right? Because then it also prevents Soviets from, doing whatever, or at least gives them pause for consideration, right?
Yep, that's the idea. That's the whole theory crafting behind a nuclear deterrent. Is if I've got nukes, you're not going to come near me. Is that where they? Is that current there, Spud?
Yeah, as of 2023, at least last time that was reported. So
Okay, so it looks like Belgium, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, and Turkey all have U.S. nukes in Europe. Okay.
One thing that's kind of interesting is, I guess we have 450 operational missile silos in the U.S. right now. Only 400 of them are armed. 50 are kept empty.
Hmm.
Kind of do like a switcheroo kind of thing, or maybe
Yeah,
they
like
could
a,
be
a
armed if
red,
you want to.
red card, red
You
card,
never
find the red
know.
card, red card, red card.
Yeah, it's to find the pea under the cup. But the thing that I find really funny, maybe not, is that all of the silos are located in North Dakota, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, and Nebraska. So, like, very unpopulous states that are not close to any of the major coastal cities, which I think is interesting.
Yes.
it's because they're a priority target. So
Yeah, put it
if,
out
if
put it out in the out in the woods.
Well, so both the Soviet Union and the U.S. did the same thing. Is as they started building silos, they had a sort of gentleman's agreement that they more or less, there was maps of attack targets, and so every major city was an attack target. And then they're like, well, then it's like, well, you're killing our people, that's bad. And they're like, well, we'll put our silos here, and everyone kind of knew where each other's silos were. But the idea was is they would arm the silos and spread them out so that, like, they would be forced to nuke each other's silo fields in order to try and reduce the amount of nukes that got launched in a counterattack. It was basically there's a whole bunch of maps you can see about the theory of how they did it. But the reason they did it is, like, I am actually at a very high risk of where I live, because I'm, like, directly north of a whole bunch of those silos for, like, delayed radiation. Although, granted, the city I live in is also a target because we have a NATO airbase here. So we would get hit directly, and then all the nukes that blew up all the missile silos in North Dakota would probably, the radiation, if the wind was right, would just land all over where we are. But that was part of the game theory is that, yeah, if you put the silos near a city, the cities were already going to get nuked, as sort of one school of thought. So, as a thing, so if you put the silos out in the middle of nowhere, and then also they could build them and, like, people would leave them alone, like, especially in the 60s and stuff in Montana, you really have to go to like, I think the closest ones to me are in Minot, Mino, I don't know how you say it, North Dakota. And it's
My
like,
nuts.
my nuts. It's like 300 miles from any major city of any kind. Like, it's literally like the middle of nowhere in a field.
Makes sense. You want to take out our weapons? Come claim places no one cares about. Go.
At 500 miles, just like the ladies, 500 miles from my nuts.
Apologies if anyone lives there. You're important.
Reminds me of a Japanese tactic in the Second World War. They had these hot air balloons that were fire bombs. And in their minds, they're like, we'll just send these fire bombs over to the United States and Canada, and they will cause all forms of destruction on their cities. I don't think they really recognized how big and sparsely populated our countries were. And so the fire bombs floated over and then landed in the middle of a field, and nobody really even noticed.
Oh no.
That's why.
Yeah. Oh no, my crops. Like, that's a problem, but Okay.
Just grow back him.
Yeah. I'm going to jump into the next section. We're good to go. The next era in the Cold War is, as you can imagine, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, a little calmer. It involves a lot less direct kind of pissing contests and a lot more clandestine activity. So this is just a general Wikipedia article on this whole period. It's often called a period of détente. Détente is a French term meaning that, like, you're coming to an agreement. You're no longer fighting. You're trying to work things out. And so the 1970s broadly, late 60s and 70s broadly, are considered a period of détente. But that doesn't mean they're still not fucking with each other. And big evidence of that is the Vietnam War. So the Vietnam War starts before this. It actually starts as a French colonial war. France had a colony called Indochina, and in the aftermath of the Second World War, they started losing their colonies all over the globe. And France, being firmly dedicated to brotherhood, egalitarianism, and fraternité, égalité, and oh shit, what's the third one? Fraternité, égalité. Let's just say democracy. Because they were so dedicated to that, they definitely declared war on all of their colonial subjects to make sure that they stayed within the French Empire. And during the French Indochina War, France lost, and communist rebels started to take control. And in 1964, Americans had been supporting the French efforts for some time. But in 1964, this is after Kennedy's assassination, so Johnson is now president. An escalation is authorized after something called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. Now, I've never actually looked up what the Gulf of Tonkin incident was. Looks like fired upon and damaged torpedo boats approaching in the Gulf of Tonkin. There you go. So, conflict between American boats and North Vietnamese boats. The Vietnam War is very contentious, very confusing as well, because this was a French colony, and the Americans are going in. Why? And really, it's to try and contain the spread of communism. But that's not exactly something that is very popular at home. It doesn't fly with the American public, not because they have any great love for communism, but they just don't necessarily want to fight wars for it. There's also social conflict that starts arising across the Western democratic powers. So this includes the Troubles in Northern Ireland, where violence really starts to escalate between terrorists on both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland's side. There's also a whole bunch of disorder in the United States. I've just chosen the Black Panther Party as kind of emblematic of not the civil rights movement writ large, but the violent side, the kind of revolutionary side of the civil rights movement. And then we also had in Canada the Front de Libération de Québec, FLQ. They took hostages. They conducted bombings. This was a pretty scary moment for us. But the thing that all of these have in common is Soviet support. So as the Americans are bogged down in Vietnam, trying to fend off the spread of communism in Southeast Asia, the communists are funding separatist and revolutionary parties back home in our respective countries. This is something that was always alleged, and I'd heard allegations when I was a kid, but it was always said like slander, like, oh, you don't have to listen to them, they're communists. Like, well, I mean, what does that even mean, kind of thing. As a kid, this was what I would ask. And it's not entirely certain even if these groups knew that they were being funded by the Soviet Union or cared, because they had their own goals, they had their own aims, and where the money came from doesn't really matter. They were not doing, one thing that can be said for sure is that they're not doing the bidding of Moscow. These are people who wanted to do trouble, whether that's terrorism, whether that's just, in your face political activity. They wanted to be a bother to the population at large and the governments of the democratic West. And the Soviet Union just supplied them with money. So this is the calm period of the Cold War. We also get the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968. This is the late 60s. So in Hungary, that was a repudiation of the Warsaw Pact and the repudiation of communism. And the Soviets reacted violently and without mercy. In Czechoslovakia in 1968, they wanted to wear jeans. They wanted to listen to rock and roll. This was not a repudiation of the Warsaw Pact, and this was not a repudiation of communism. They were totally fine, well, to a certain extent. They were willing to live within the system. They just wanted more freedoms of self-expression. And that was not allowed in the Soviet Union. Or, well, this is the Warsaw Pact. That was not allowed in the behind the Iron Curtain. I am not aware. I know I've kind of done some equivalencies here, talking about, the Soviets invade one country and we sponsor coups in other countries and so on, and kind of looking both of these things as bad. I am not aware, and I could be wrong, so feel free to correct me, but I'm not aware of us staging a coup against someone who was our friend and ally but just wanted to listen to different music, that wanted more freedom of expression. And this conflict was deeply damaging to the Warsaw Pact and the relationship between the Soviet Union and the member states of the Warsaw Pact, because they saw it too. They wondered how minimal is the infraction that leads to tanks. And it's important to note that while there was violence and there was violent repression of these various groups, the level of violence is always higher in the Soviet response. They always go for more tanks. Spud's putting in some photos here of, I'm guessing this is from the Prague Spring.
Yep, the tanks and the people rigging the tanks and then setting them on fire because they just wanted pants and to hang out. And then tanks came, and then the Czechs assaulted them with their bodies.
Yeah.
Many of them
So,
got ran over, though.
yes. Amidst this period of time, we have the famous visit of Richard Nixon going to China. Now, you may have heard this tossed aside as just a statement, and I don't just what does this mean? What is going on here? Richard Nixon is an anti-communist crusader. The idea that he would go overseas to have a conversation with a communist leadership is, there better be a good reason for it, more or less. But he also, the reason if you've ever heard only Nixon can go to China is that Nixon had, and this is a hilarious phrase to say, Nixon had the legitimacy of being so anti-communist that you wouldn't suspect that he was being swayed by them by talking to them. We actually have something kind of similar going on right now. This is modern contemporary Canadian politics, so I'll wake everyone up in a few minutes when I'm done talking. Our current government is run by a guy named Mark Carney, and he is going down to the United States and he is talking with Donald Trump and flattering him in various ways. And for the most part, his actions are being approved up here because, Trump is distracted and not causing us further pain. We had just had an election. Mark Carney was only recently elected as prime minister, and the other potential candidate is a guy named Pierre Poilievre. And if he had won, he would have to go down to the United States and do all these sorts of same things. But it is very obvious that if Poilievre did the same things, the flattering of Trump, that Carney is doing, it would not be well received. Because Poilievre is viewed, at least by a large contingent of Canadians, as kind of compromised by Trump, that he's already too sympathetic, whereas they assume Carney is not sympathetic at all. And that's the same kind of perspective as Nixon going to China, where, he was a hard-ass anti-communist, and he's going to chat with the communist leadership. And what this meeting was meant to do is to start the process of opening China up to the West. Mao Zedong was dead, and so China had a changeover in leadership. He was dead, right? I didn't just make that up. Pretty sure he was dead. Yeah. And one of the things that this meeting resulted in is the recognition of China as the People's Republic of China, as the actual official representative of China, which meant that they got China's seat on the Security Council in the UN. China, the nationalist government, had been a major contributor to the Allied cause in the Second World War, and so because they defeated Japan, they got a permanent seat on the Security Council. But then they promptly lost the Civil War to the communists. In the intervening decades, the veto and the Security Council seat had remained with the nationalist government in Taiwan. And it was in the aftermath of this meeting that Communist China got that veto and really brings them into the global system and brings them onto the global stage. but just to make sure everyone knows, we're still not done cooing. In 1973, maybe the election wasn't in 73. In the early 70s, a democratic socialist leader named Salvador Allende was elected in Chile. He had a whole lot of popular policies that he was looking to implement. Did not seem to be particularly connected to the Soviet Union, but he definitely was a socialist. And so it was decided that he had to be couped and a capitalist needed to be put in place. So the Allende was ousted by the military. Augusto Pinochet was installed, a general, as leader, and an authoritarian government was put in place, but it was a capitalist authoritarian government. And this is an unrelated article. It's just about another coup in Peru, but it had this box at the bottom. These are a list of coups, self-coups, and attempted coups in the Americas since 1900. And this box is not at the bottom of every list, so I'm not going to say that the United States is involved in all of these, but a lot of them, for sure. These are countries in their neighborhood, in their bailiwick. So, yeah, there are still processes going on where countries are denied their own self-determination.
I wonder what the most couped country in Central America is.
Ooh. That's a good question. If I just copy that.
Just as a curiosity, like which country has had like their stuff messed with in some way, like internally, externally, just who's had the least successful string of government continuation or continuance, I guess.
In the last week, France.
Correct.
No, this is going to take me a while because the formatting is all fuckered. That's a good question. I don't know.
Yeah, this is coups, self coups, and attempted coups. Self coups sound like a ritual suicide kind of maneuver.
Yeah. Well, it's the idea. If I'm remembering correctly, the idea is that maybe you have a democratic government, but it's not going anywhere, and so you would really like it to be a dictatorship, and so you're just like, oh, if only. What's the famous quote from the English king? If what can be done about this troublesome priest or whatever, you just kind of like walk by your military and like, oh, it'd be terrible if somebody were to coup me today, and then the military like steps in and stages a coup, but like the president stays the same. I'm not sure exactly. I'm sure I could look it up. It's a link. But that's that section, and I've just got one more. Kind of the late 70s and then through the 80s and 90s. But any questions on we went over in the kind of throughout the late 60s and throughout the 70s?
One question about the bottom picture. Is the lady in the middle wearing pants or no pants?
In the middle.
It looks like no pants.
It looks like jean shorts.
Where? Oh, I see.
The lady with the green top and the brown legs.
And the no
ostensibly.
pants.
I'm gonna go with those are like leotards or something. Because it's not her skin color.
Unless
No,
very
people-
tan legs, not as tan upper body.
I was gonna say I'm not a biologist, but I'm pretty sure people don't tan that way. I think
Yeah, that how hard that would be to do. Like
I only sun my legs and I keep my arms entirely hidden from the sun at all times except in this photo.
I'm sure every single lady in that picture can do harder things than I can.
Yes, that is true. They are members. They are members of the ultra right wing Contra killers. uh, so, any questions on what I've gone over so far? Is people just want this to end? Are you enjoying yourselves? I need
This is
feedback,
great.
people.
Yes,
That's
it's good.
fantastic.
It's good. We're
I'm
we're
enjoying
also
myself. I'm just listening, man.
I'm having
yeah,
fun,
this is good.
enjoying. This is good stuff.
All right, good. Okay, if there's nothing further, then I will jump into the last section.
Oh, and just for the record, the place with the most coups is Pigeon Island.
Nice. Well done. Well done.
Thank you.
That's the new album of the Cambridge Five.
Pigeon Island.
Guaranteed to coup you.
The Pigeon Island tour. I'm in.
Who's next?
Oh, Kuzo.
God.
So
They
good.
have a song dedicated to all of the porta potties lined up at the show. This song is called ICBM.
All right. So, the 1970s, the late 1970s, are a bit busy. In 1979, the Shah of Iran, who was installed by both British and American forces in 1953, technically, sorry, I should rephrase. He had been installed much earlier, but in 1953, the democratic government of Mohammad Mossadegh was overthrown because he was a communist. And the Shah was given absolute power in Iran, whereas before he had been a constitutional monarch. And his regime was incredibly oppressive. The people of Iran did not like it, or at least some people in Iran did not like it. And the revolution occurred amongst fervent, religious zealots, is the best way to put it. And so Iran, the secular government was overthrown, and an Islamist government was put in place. So this ends the Kingdom of Iran and starts the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that's the government that's in power to this day. Up to that point, Iran had been a strong American ally, and so Iran had a lot of American military equipment, and this was deeply troubling because a lot of Cold War thinking was zero sum. If we lose, that means the Soviets win. And so there was just this automatic assumption that, well, our guy, the Shah, was overthrown. So obviously these new guys are hooked in with the Soviets. And not really. Like, sure, but not in any kind of like major ideological way. In fact, the communist there was a communist insurgency against the Iranian Revolution, and that exists as a terrorist organization to this day called the MEK. That's a story for another day. But 1979, Islamic Revolution happens in Iran. Also in 1979 comes the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. A few years earlier, the government of Afghanistan had been overthrown because nobody leaves anybody alone during the Cold War. This time, though, I think it had been a monarchy that was overthrown by a communist dictatorship, and that dictatorship was not dictatoring good enough. It needed help. And so the Soviets invaded to essentially murder the guy who had done the coup and install their own guy and shore up the communist government of Afghanistan. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan has been called the Soviets' Vietnam. I mean, there are some parallels. They did lose. They withdrew. But it's not really. I personally don't think that it's really comparable. But the one thing that it did do is sapped Soviet ability to respond. It was a major endeavor to conduct this war, and they were unable to respond to other other conflicts brewing. In the aftermath of the Islamic Revolution in Iran, a nominal U.S. ally, and I did say that correctly, U.S. ally, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, thought he might get some bonus points if he invaded Iran. The Iraqi army was one of the most well-trained and well-outfitted in the region. They were largely outfitted with Soviet equipment, so they were closer to the Soviets, but they were kind of a playing both sides against the center sort of deal. And the invasion of Iran was a kind of attempt at ingratiating themselves further with the Americans. And it did not go well for them. The invasion solidified Iranians in defense of the revolution, even if they wouldn't necessarily have defended it beforehand. And it also completely destroyed the Iraqi military. The Spud, you're gonna know what jets. What jets did Iran have?
F-14s.
Okay, so Iran had F-14s, and the Iraqis had the Soviet equivalents. And the one thing that an F-14 can do that the Soviet equivalent couldn't do is an over-the-horizon attack. And so when the Iraqis are flying their jets into battle, they just start exploding before they even know what's going on. And long story short, the war lasted 8 years, cost how many? Just hundreds of thousands of lives, and accomplished nothing aside from making everybody in the area poorer and sadder. But I include this in addition to the kind of peripheral relationship. This is kind of a conflict that is signaling a weakening of the Cold War, because Iran is not at this time an ally of the Soviets or of the Americans. And really, Iraq is not an ally of the Soviets or the Americans. Nominally, Iraq had been more aligned with the Soviets, and Iran before the revolution was definitely an American ally. But this is kind of a conflict between two neighbors that just hate each other. And yes, there's some political gain that they're going for in the Cold War, but it's not. There's no puppet masters directing it from Washington or Moscow. And that's somewhat illustrating a bit of a weakening of control of the major powers during the latter stage of the Cold War. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in the Soviet Union, and he institutes two policies which he thinks will help reform and improve the Soviet Union, but ultimately will destroy it. And these are glasnost and perestroika. I can't remember which one is which. That's why I didn't bother putting up the links or putting their names out there. He just wants the country to open up and be more accepting of a diversity of opinions. So the tanks in the 1968 Czechoslovakian, because they wanted jeans. Gorbachev is kind of a guy like maybe they should just have jeans. Maybe we should just let people have jeans if they want it. And so he starts trying to open up the Soviet Union to economic opportunities and to cultural influences that have been shut off for decades. In the midst of these reforms, the Chernobyl disaster happens. If anyone hasn't seen the 5-part HBO miniseries Chernobyl, please watch it. It is phenomenal. It is just excellent. But the long story short is reactor 4. Chernobyl has 4 nuclear reactors, and the 4th one explodes, showering Ukraine and Belarus with radiation and polluting all of Western Europe and Northern Europe for decades. People had to take iodine supplements for decades just to be safe. The cost to contain the Chernobyl disaster was astronomical. But the Soviet, on the one hand, the Soviets paid it. They did do it. But it was not just a blow financially, but a blow to the Soviet way of doing things. In this era when things are trying to open up and trying to reform, the failings of the system are literally exploding around people.
Yeah, I'll plus one Dingo's thing to the show as well. It's an interesting thing. What many people have watched watch it, and I always get their to have their takes on it. And a lot of people are like, oh, this is why we can't have nuclear power. And I'm like, did you not understand why this happened? The nuclear power was the thing that happened. The nuclear incident is what happened, but the reason behind it was all of the systems surrounding how science was handled, who had authority on different things, the fear of cover-ups, who was ultimately right, not sharing information, not looking bad on the world stage. There's a 20-page thing you could list of things that people be like, well, why would you do it that way? That's the screw up. And I'm like, because that was part of the Soviet system. Don't admit things. Don't certain people have ultimate authority. All those kind of things like that.
Yeah, there's a line that's repeated, and it's worth repeating in the series, and it's every lie we tell incurs a debt to the truth. And ultimately, the character who says that line says that that they're suffering from their lies. It's their lies that are overwhelming them. Now, that's an artistic license. That's the perspective that the writer and the show writer, what the hell is it called for TV?
Screenwriter?
No,
Director?
showrunner. The writer and showrunner is a guy named Craig Mazin, and that's the direction he took. But I think it's a phenomenal take, and I agree with it entirely. Yeah, and it's a great series. From the music to the set design, very powerfully acted as well. But
I
moving
will
on.
say,
Yeah.
just to like, it's not necessarily correcting you because historically it's probably accurate, but iodine 131 only has a half-life of like 8 days, so there's really no reason to have taken iodine supplements for decades. There's
Oh, I have no idea why, but people
a,
took it
a
took it for
massive
decades.
overreaction to the fallout of Chernobyl. If you look at a map, it's like most countries got like 50 becquerels per square meter, or yeah, per square meter, which is 50 atomic disintegrations per second. But there's literally a trillion atoms in a cubic meter of air. So it is only detectable because we are able to detect radiation so well. And the actual amount of radiation, otherwise you would see absolutely no impact on health effects.
Ah, there you go. For me
That's my
to-
2 cents.
Yeah, I did not know that. The thing I would say is, I think it was worries over food and water supply, and not necessarily just what's in the soil. However, I'm also totally, I can believe that it would be an overreaction, um, because there's also a scenario of, do we know how much is actually out there? The Soviets have lied to us in the past. So yeah,
I think you can get tours there now. You have to pay a bit, but you can actually take tours through limited parts of.
before the full scale invasion in 22, yes. I don't think
Yeah,
you can currently.
yeah. I have seen some stuff from people doing tours through there, and one of the things I always thought was kind of interesting from a U.S. perspective, I guess. Um, they can go into the classrooms there that the children used to be in because of what happened. They dropped everything and left. They didn't go grab anything. Obviously, they just left. Well, if you go in the classrooms, you could see the stuff where they were really pushing like patriotism, nationalism, really pushing the kids to do things like saying their version of the pledge to their country. The US had started doing that just a hair before them, and we still do it today. And it's why so many countries look at us and think we're so weird that every morning in class we grew up and you stood up and you put your hand over your heart and you said the Pledge of Allegiance, and we had God in that, and the level of patriotism, especially in, I believe you would be looking at Gen X and Gen Y, that was heavily pushed on us as kids to be extremely patriotic, and US is the only thing, is very sad. It was very heavily pushed on us, and I guess it was very, very heavily pushed on them as well. And I didn't realize that until I'd seen some of the footage out of Chernobyl from people going there in the classrooms and things. I thought it was really sad, and it's disturbing because it's very us first and nobody else, and I really hate that. It's sad.
Yeah, that's like that can be a byproduct of nationalism for sure. I have a coworker right now who's Ukrainian, and we were chatting about our respective childhoods. And I was in a youth organization in this country called Scouts. You know, we have different levels for youth. So we start off as beavers when you're 5 years old, and then you move on to cubs when you're like 7 to 9 or 10 or something, and then you move into
Pictures,
scouts.
boys and girls.
It is boys and girls now, and it started being boys and girls, I think, in the mid '90s. When I started, it was just boys in scouting, and then we had girl guides for girls.
And brownies. Wasn't brownies was the
Yeah,
the youngest ones? Yeah.
yeah. Brownies was
We
the
have a version
equivalent.
of it here.
Yeah, brownies was the equivalent to beavers in cubs.
Mhm.
There was no cub equivalent. I think that they went from brownies straight into guides. So I think guides was just twice as long, whereas cubs and scouts were separated out.
There's actually a really good book. It's called Scouting for Boys.
It's interesting. So
Yeah.
in the US, we have Girl Scouts and Boy Scouts. I don't know all the levels for Boy Scouts and how theirs work, but we were always separated. Girl Scouts, we started when we were about 5 years old, and I was a daisy. And I worked all the way up through the entire ranks. I only had like a year and a half left. And when my parents moved me away from the area that we were in, there wasn't a Girl
troop.
Scouts that was at the same level as me. So I wasn't able to finish it because it was by age.
Mm.
So if you didn't start at Daisies, you could start later on, but you couldn't make up like Daisies. So it was like Daisies and Brownies, and there was one other, and then Juniors. But yeah, I have like tons of badges and everything that I did from earning that stuff. Girl
Mm.
Scouts has since astronomically failed. People just don't want to do it. In order to be a scout leader here for Girl Scouts, you have to have started at Daisy's, gone through the entire program, then become an adult, and then put in to be a scout leader.
Wow.
So we just don't have enough people here that do that. So it's been failing for quite some time. So the Boy Scouts has now opened up to girls being allowed to be in it, and so they just call it Scouts. So the boys and girls are together, and I know some people that have their kids in them together. They'll be like within the age group, and then they'll
Right.
be siblings doing them together.
Well,
But there's a lot of patriotism in that. Like I run across people all the time here that they don't know how to put up the flag correctly on a flagpole or take it down correctly if you're having to do it by yourself. They're letting it touch the ground and all this other stuff. And I had to learn how to do all of that. I've retired multiple US flags, so when people sit and have this fit over, "Oh, you can't burn a flag." I'm like, "How do you think we retire it, you idiot?"
well,
Like
the reason I brought it up is that I was comparing with this friend. Um, there was an equivalent kind of Soviet scouting kind of group. I forget the name of it. He told it to me, but the thing is that as patriotic and as, you know, another term for this is jingoistic, as you might think for our own systems. Um, they were like directly pushing like 5-year-olds into the military. So
oh
it's
Jesus.
it was like just that much more, you know, there's always a vague quasi military character. Yeah, young pioneers, that's exactly it. Thank you, Weenus. There's a quasi military character or paramilitary character to Cubs and guides in Canada, but it's nowhere near the level that it seems to have been pushed in the Soviet Union on a kind of militaristic scale.
Yeah, there
And
was a lot of things about it that was very militaristic here in the US. Um, the thing that I found really interesting is that the Mormon church took very heavily to the Boy Scouts, they not the Girl Scouts. That's probably why the Boy Scouts pushed forward. A lot of the kids, a lot of the boys that were in Boy Scouts through at least my generation ended up in the military here in the US. And there's a lot of parallels to it.
well, I mean, you know, there's like level progression. Badges are like medals or just pips, you know, that sort of thing. But I
Yep.
would say that the parallel is it's a similarity of aesthetics, not a similarity of treatment. Whereas I think in the Soviet system they were like treated like tiny soldiers. Um,
Yeah, no, we were tiny soldiers. I've marched in multiple parades, held up US flags for ceremonies, white glove ceremonies, full uniform. I've done all that.
gotcha. Okay. Um, I have completely lost where I was going with that, bringing that concept up. So now I'm just going to talk about tearing down the Berlin Wall.
Yay.
Um, so part of the process of
You
opening up
were talking about Chernobyl, and then we talked about scouts based on what was in the classrooms.
in the
If that
classrooms.
helps.
Thank you. Yes. So I think we've thoroughly covered that topic and we can move on. Thank you, sir. Um, so there's a very funny story of how the Berlin Wall came to come down. Um, the wall had a series of checkpoints that were with armed guards, and it was very dangerous to try and approach, let alone to try and escape through the wall. But you could still leave East Berlin. There was a corridor that you could take. I mean, you would have to leave through East Germany, but there was a corridor that you could take through Hungary in order to leave the country. And it appears the administrative burden of this, kind of handling people going through Hungary was starting to get annoying to the East German government. And so they wanted to open up access through the wall. But they left vague instructions for the guy who was doing the announcement. And so he just sort of winged it. And he said, well, the wall is now open for anyone who wants to leave at any time, effective immediately. And so the population of East Berlin got up out of their chairs, out of their houses, out of their apartments, and went to the wall. And those soldiers had been tasked with shoot to kill if anyone tries to get over. But when confronted with literally the entire population of East Berlin, they hesitated. And people just went through. And they climbed over and they tore down razor wire, and they dismantled checkpoints, and it just sort of happened. It was actually generally quite peaceful, and considering the violence that had preceded various forms of personal expression in Warsaw Pact countries, this was something very new, and it showcased a very tired and administratively burdened organization that just couldn't handle things anymore. And so the wall came down. Thousands fled East Berlin into West Berlin. Families were reunited because the wall went up, but there was no consideration taken to who might be on either side. And German reunification, East Germany and West Germany combining back together as one, happened the next year after the wall came down. So that was in 1990. Keep in mind the Soviet Union still exists. The Warsaw Pact still exists. And West Germany was a part of NATO. But things were bad enough for everything in the Warsaw Pact and the Soviet Union that effectively East Germany joining NATO was they couldn't do anything about it. And in following along the fall of the Berlin Wall, there was a series of revolutions in 1989. And these are in Warsaw Pact countries: Poland, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Bulgaria, Romania, Yugoslavia, Albania, Mongolia. So these are not Soviet Union, basically, but deeply allied countries. And instead of reform, they wanted the system gone. They wanted freedom. They wanted the ability to choose. When it came to the idea of collective ownership or individual ownership, they wanted individual ownership. And CERN has got a is that yours, CERN? Did you go through? Are you old enough to have gone through Checkpoint Charlie?
You can go through as a tourist.
Oh,
No, I didn't go through the real Checkpoint Charlie.
I'm like, I don't think they had stages back then, but yeah, okay.
Just
Yeah.
do a little trippy trip to East Berlin.
That's cool. Spud,
mean-
when you were in Berlin, did you do anything on the wall? He's not listening. I've lost him. That's fine. That's cool.
I mean, I wasn't old enough to remember a whole lot of it, but I remember 1990. I remember my mom really sitting and watching it intently, and she made me sit for a little of it and tried to explain a little of it to me, but it was over my 5, 6 year old head.
Both of my parents were in the military, and my father basically said, "Boy, come here, sit down. This is history." And I
Yeah.
watched the Berlin Wall come down, and I didn't really know what it was. I tried to figure out. I tried to ask questions.
Yeah, and it was the same for me. I was like, "Huh."
But what it did mean, at least in a Canadian context, is that a lot of people in the military are out of a job.
I know, right?
So Gorbachev's efforts to reform the system and open it up for alteration ultimately led enough people to go, look, we fucking hate it. Let's get out. And so they did. And all of these countries uh, demand the resignation of their communist governments and demand free and fair elections. And they get them all across the Eastern Bloc. German reunification happens. And then finally, in 1991, we get the dissolution of the Soviet Union, where several representatives from the different governments within the Soviet Union all meet in a room and vote to just dissolve themselves. Now, that technically ends the Cold War, but not really, because there's still Russian soldiers even in East Germany. There's Russian soldiers in East Germany until 1994. And so you can picture it, there's Soviet or ex-Soviet soldiers stationed in a military base in a NATO country until 1994. And there's also the Russians set up these breakaway republics in former Soviet satellites. So this is a country called Moldova, and then the highlighted red portion is called Transnistria. It's a region within Moldova. And Russia has basically pulled that away from Moldova and tries to administer it as its own separate thing under military occupation. To this day, Moldova just had an election, and it was against a whole host of Russian oppression and misinformation. In the Republic of Georgia, there's two regions. One of them is called South Ossetia. The other one, I forget. But that is another region that the modern Russian state, in 2008, Russia fought a short war against Georgia to maintain control over these regions. And of course, Russia's entire conflict with Ukraine, starting in 2014 and then escalating in 2022, is a fallout from this dissolution of the Soviet Union. As part of, so Spud mentioned, I didn't actually put up a tab about it, but Spud mentioned the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the protection of nuclear weapons. So that was American policy number one, was make sure nuclear weapons do not fall into the hands of just random terrorists. If it's in the hands of the Russian government, so be it. It doesn't matter if we're politically aligned or not. That's better than, breakaway republics, ethnic cleansers, these sorts of things. And they spent a lot of time, energy, and money to ensure that nuclear weapons kind of were counted and gotten to their to a supposedly trustworthy owner. And that's kind of it. That's all I've prepared for the Cold War. I didn't go into. I had this picture here. I had intended to go into the Contras and Iran Contra, but for some reason I deleted those tabs and they're gone now. But it was just another effort from the Americans to overthrow a government in Central and South America, and they were directly supporting anti-communist rebels, the Contras, and the Iran-Contra affair was they were smuggling, or they were not smuggling, they were laundering the weapons and the funds for the weapons through Iran. And then this image here is of Mujahideen fighters. So these are the folks that defeated the Soviets in Afghanistan. And they are also the folks who would later join with Osama bin Laden, who was a member of the Mujahideen, to enact the September 11th attacks. these actions have consequences, and the funding and creation and training of the Mujahideen eventually led to the global war on terror, which is another interesting story. But yeah, so that's what I've got prepared. Any questions on anything I talked about this evening? Anything you want to talk about more? Have I missed anything that you wanted? Please speak up. Let me know.
Would you say that the economy was the main, like one of the largest reasons for the collapse of the Soviet Union?
Well, to a certain extent, there's the Soviet Union was kind of swaying and creaking and groaning in all directions, and their economy did definitely contribute to that. I can't remember an exact number, but definitely on the order of over 50% of their economic output was geared towards the military towards the end, and that's just unsustainable. Um, I have anecdotal stories of, in 1988, 1989, when you're in Moscow, which is the capital of the Soviet Union and supposedly the crown jewel of communism, and you can't even buy cabbage because the shortages are so strong. Um, so decidedly, the okay, how should I phrase this fairly? The way
You don't
in
gotta be
which
fair. You just gotta be right.
well, I mean, it's impossible to be right. You don't seek truth in history. That's for the philosophy department. You can just construct a recreation that is hopefully, honest and fair. Anyway, um, the oh shit, I lost my train of thought. Um, the way in which the Soviet Union enacted a planned economy, if there is a right way, I don't personally believe that there is a right way to do a planned economy. But what I can say, if there is a right way, the Soviet Union didn't figure it out. Because the way that they did it was wrong. And it ultimately failed them. Did that answer your question?
I think so. And I actually have to run to the store, but thank you so much for putting this on. Always really enjoy this and appreciate the time and effort that you put into sharing and teaching us something and getting to actually learn something. So I'm going to dip out, but thank you so much.
No, thanks for stopping by. Have a good evening.
Is that a moist beaver?
Dingo, tell us about Vladimir Putin.
Oh God.
When's he come into all this?
So during the Cold War, Putin was a relatively low-level functionary in East Germany. He was a member of the KGB. Um, After the fall of the Soviet Union, he transferred back to Russia. Had a fairly behind-the-scenes career. I think he became mayor of St. Petersburg and found a way to kind of ingratiate himself and integrate himself into the highest levels of power in amongst the chaos of the 1990s. So, with the end of the planned economy, the idea from economic experts to handle the transition from a planned economy, which the Soviet Union had, to an open economy like what we have, they called it shock therapy, and they said we should just make the transition as quickly as possible, and that way, things will just even out very fast. Well, it didn't. In fact, the shock was very shocking, and for a lot of people, the 1990s were lawless, gang-ridden, no money. The ruble had to be redenominated, I think, at least once, if not twice. So that means their money just became worthless, entirely worthless, and they had to like make new money. And during
The Ruble 2.
yeah, Ruble 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Hmm.
Amidst the chaos of the 1990s, Putin finds a way to kind of worm his way into the upper levels of power and gets the ear of Boris Yeltsin, who is the elected and very imperfect leader of Russia, of Russian Federation. And whatever magic he pulls on Yeltsin, he gets him to name him his successor. He then stages some false flag attacks in Moscow, burning down some apartment buildings and blaming it on Chechnyan terrorists as a way of creating a conflict that needs to be resolved. Gets elected on a resounding established peace and order ticket, and then proceeds to engage in a brutal war against Chechnya, which Russia had already. Chechnya is a region in the Caucasus Mountains that is part of the Russian Federation. It attempted to break away. I mentioned all of these regions that had they ousted their communist governments, had elections, and it just sort of they just got their freedom, and that was it. Well, those were countries outside of the Russian Federation. If you were somebody inside the Russian Federation, Russia didn't want you to go, and so the Chechens wanted to go. These are a Turkic people. They speak Chechen is a Turkic language. The region is also majority Muslim. So as you can imagine, it's not necessarily on equal footing with the rest of Russia. And in the first Chechen War, the Russian army went in and got its ass handed to it by a bunch of uncoordinated rebels. By the time Putin comes into the second Chechen War, he doesn't care about casualties, and so he just hits them with the Russian army until they give up. And then it all goes downhill from there.
Hmm.
Is that a
Thanks for that. Yeah, no, that's good. There's always more to learn.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And I mean, and I'm not perfect either. I'm sure I've made mistakes here this evening. So please keep these in mind as broad information and informative, not the gospel truth, if at all possible.
I'm gonna put it in my bibliography.
Yeah.
A guy I play video games with told me in the middle of the night while I was cleaning my sink, so
Exactly.
must be right.
All right. If there's no further questions, then I think we'll call an end to this meeting of the Midnight Society. What is it from Goosebumps?
Oh, that's been forever.
I wish I had a fire I could throw some sugar into. But oh no, that's Are You Afraid of the Dark, not Goosebumps.
I love that.
I might be confusing my TV shows, my mid-90s
I mean,
scary
they
kids
were
TV
both.
shows.
Yeah, they were both super popular at the same time. So.
But all right, so if there's no further questions, thanks for coming out, everybody, and I'll have some new topics in a week or two that you can vote on, and then a new date in November at some point.